The sound was small. That was the insult of it. A spoon slipped from my hand and hit the sink metal on enamel, a sharp little clap that shouldn't have meant anything. I stood there with the tap running, watching the water hit the bowl like it was trying to drill through it, and my chest tightened the way it used to when a radio clicked in the dark. My body doesn't care about context. It hears a certain kind of noise and decides it's time to be ready. I turned off the tap and dried my hands slowly, like speed could invite something back into the room. It was late. The city outside my window, Dranov, my adopted capital with too many lights and too few familiar corners, had settled into its night pattern. Someone's television leaked laughter through the wall. A tram whined in the distance. The building's pipes sighed as if they were tired too. I had been alone all evening, not in a tragic way, just in the practical way of a man who has learned company comes with expectations. The spoon sound pulled one specific night out of storage, not a montage of war, not a blur of smoke and shouting, a single moment where I hesitated before giving an order. People like clean labels. They want to know if you froze or if you were brave, if you were decisive, or if you were weak. Real life is more irritating. I hesitated because I was trying to do the math fast enough to prevent a bigger loss. I hesitated because I thought one more second might show me the right choice. That second cost one man his future in my unit and cost me something I still can't name without sounding dramatic. So I don't name it, I just live with it. I was infantry back then, attached to the 14th Mixed Detachment, mixed meaning, assembled from whoever was left, and detachment meaning, don't ask too many questions. We didn't have a proud insignia. We had a stencil number on a truck door and a joke someone drew on a wall that got painted over when new officers visited. We operated in the grays areas of maps where lines were drawn and redrawn, and you learn not to trust anything that looked official. The night I keep returning to happened near a place called Vesna, hollow, dip between hills where fog sat like a wet blanket, and every sound traveled wrong. Our task sounded simple in daylight: move across a strip of broken orchards to check a cluster of abandoned houses that were being used as a relay point, retrieve a radio component our engineer swore we needed, and pull back before dawn. No heroics, no speeches. Just a job meant to keep other jobs possible. We left after midnight. 14 men moving in a loose file, each one trying not to be the reason the line stopped. Cold air, dry ground, boots scuffing lightly. The moon was thin and useless. The orchard trees were skeletal, the kind of branches that look like hands in the wrong light. I remember the smell most: damp bark, old smoke, a hint of fertilizer that made the place feel wrongfully domestic, like someone had tried to keep living there and failed. I was second in command of the patrol, which is a polite way of saying I was the man the lieutenant leaned on when he didn't want to think too hard. The lieutenant was a decent guy named Soren, young, ambitious in a quiet way, the kind of officer who believed in doing things correctly because correctness was one of the few things he could control. He wasn't foolish. He wasn't cruel. He was just new enough to still want a clean conscience. I had an older conscience, already stained from smaller decisions, and maybe that's why he let me run the spacing and the timing. I was good at the dull parts. The dull parts keep you alive. One of the men in the patrol was a kid named Leshko. Not a child, not exactly. 19? He had the kind of face that still looked like it belonged in a school corridor. All sharp cheekbones and nervous energy. He joked too much during the day and went quiet at night, which was the opposite of what you want, but people don't choose their coping methods. He carried extra batteries in his vest and offered them to others like that made him useful. He wanted to be useful. That's a dangerous desire in a war because usefulness is always temporary and always exploited. Leshko was the one person that night who trusted me without caution. It wasn't earned. It was just how he attached himself to older men, the way some boys attach to coaches or uncles. That trust is part of why the memory won't leave me alone. If he had disliked me, if he had been indifferent, I could file him away with the others. But he looked at me like I knew what I was doing, and I let him. We reached the first line of houses around 1:30. The houses were empty in the way buildings are empty after they've been emptied too many times. Doors hanging open, furniture stripped, walls marked with old slogans and newer curses. A dog barked somewhere far off, then stopped as if someone had reminded it that noise was a mistake. Soren signaled a halt. We crouched behind a low stone wall that had once been part of a garden. The engineer, a squat man named Drasko, who complained constantly but fixed everything, whispered that the relay point should be inside the third house, white plaster, broken roof corner, a rusted satellite dish hanging like a dead insect. He said the radio component was in a metal case near the back room. He also said, not joking, if we get it, the radio stopped dying on us for a month. That kind of promise makes people stupid. A month without dead radios sounded like luxury. The plan was to send 2 men in. Quick check, grab the case out. Soren looked at me and then at Leshko, because Leshko was light on his feet and eager. I should have said no immediately. I should have sent someone older, someone with less need to prove themselves. But the older men were tired and slower, and the mission was supposed to be fast and quiet. I nodded at Leshko and another man, Vasco, a calm corporal with a face like carved wood. In and out, I whispered. No souvenirs. Leshko grinned too bright in the dark. He tapped his chest where the spare batteries were and mouthed something like, for luck. He and Vasco slipped over the wall and moved toward the White House, low and quick, shadows crossing broken ground. The event that still lives in me began as a sound. A soft knock of metal like something bumped against something else. Not the sharp spoon, in sync sound from my kitchen, but close enough that my body recognizes the family resemblance. Then came a second sound, a muffled shout from inside the house. Not loud, more like someone startled themselves. Soren's hand went up, freezing us. I leaned forward, trying to see through the broken window shapes. The inside of the house was black, no light. That could mean safe. That could mean someone else had learned the same rules we did. We waited. Waiting is an action in war. It's not passive. It's a choice you make with your muscles clenched and your lungs half full. In my head, the options lined up fast and ugly. If we rushed the house, we could extract our men and get out. If we waited, we might keep the operation quiet and avoid escalation, but we might also leave our two inside to whatever was happening. If we pulled back, we might save the patrol but abandon them. Abandoning them wasn't acceptable, not in words, but war makes unacceptable things happen all the time. A flash of childhood hit me then, not because I'm sentimental, but because the brain is cruel. When I was 11, my father had dragged me to the old sawmill by the river to help him repair a broken belt. The sawmill was half abandoned even then, a place where men did dangerous work for cash and didn't talk about it at home. My father had slipped his hand between two gears without thinking. The belt jumped. His thumb got pinned for a second, just long enough for him to swear through clenched teeth. I remember standing there with a wrench in my hand, watching his face go pale, and realizing that if I didn't move, no one else would. There was no one else. Responsibility arrived like a weight dropped into my arms. I tightened the bolt exactly the way he told me, and the gear released. He shook his hand, then laughed and called himself an idiot, like laughter could disinfect fear. I gave the order to withdraw. Concrete action, we lifted Leshko on an improvised stretcher, 2 rifles and a poncho, and moved back the way we came, not running but fast, trying to keep noise down while carrying a human being who was fighting his own body. External consequence, we got out of Vesna, hollow without contact. Internal consequence, as we moved, my mind replayed the hand signal. Hold. The exact moment my palm went down. Leshko survived that night. If he had died immediately, the story might have felt clearer in my head, grim but finite. Instead he lived, and living made it complicated. He lost the use of 2 fingers. He walked with a slight drag afterward. Not always, but when he was tired. His voice came back hoarse. The medics did what they could with what they had, and he spent weeks in a hospital that smelled like bleach and resignation. When he returned to the unit, he tried to act normal. He joked even more than before. He called himself half a musician now, which was a terrible joke because he had never played an instrument. But his eyes changed around me. He didn't accuse me. He didn't need to. The trust was just not there anymore. It wasn't replaced by hate. That would have been easier. It was replaced by a careful distance. He stopped offering me spare batteries. He stopped standing near me at briefings. When I spoke, he listened like I was a man to be endured, not followed. The consequence of that was practical at first. A unit needs trust the way it needs food. Without it, everything takes longer. People second guess. People don't volunteer information. People start protecting themselves inside the group. That is how units fracture, quietly, without a single dramatic betrayal. Soren noticed. He asked me what had happened between me and the kid. I told him the truth in the smallest possible package. He was hurt. He blames the night, Soren said. Do you blame the night? I didn't answer, because any answer would have been a lie. I blamed the night, and I blamed the tripwire, and I blamed the fact that we were operating on bad intelligence, and I blamed the engineer's need for that component, and I blamed myself, most of all because I was the one who made a choice with my hand. After that, I started returning to the moment again and again, not in a dramatic way, but like a tongue returns to a toothitch. What if I had ordered a rush the second? I heard the sound. Would we have prevented the tripwire? Maybe. Would we have walked into an ambush and lost more men? Maybe. The problem with maybe is that it breeds. War is full of maybes that you don't have time to examine. They pile up behind you anyway. I tried to repair things with Leshko in the only way I knew, the practical gestures. I gave him my dry socks once when his were wet. I took his watch shift when he was coughing. I asked him neutrally if he needed anything from the supply run. He accepted the socks, the shift, the supplies, but his eyes stayed guarded. Practical help doesn't repair emotional trust. It just proves you're capable of logistics. One evening, weeks after he returned, we were sitting in a half-ruined kitchen of a farmhouse, eating from tins. The room smelled like damp plaster. The radio hissed. Someone had found a pack of old playing cards, and men were half playing half, killing time. Leshko sat near the stove, hands close to the heat, staring at the flames like he was trying to see something inside them. I sat next to him because avoidance had started to feel worse. than discomfort. I said quietly, "That night." He cut me off with a small shake of his head. Not angry, just final. Concrete action. He stood up and moved to the other side of the room. Consequence, I understood he wasn't interested in my explanation. Not because he hated me, but because explanations feel like excuses when you're the one who paid the price. That was the moment my trust in myself broke. Not because I realized I was a villain, but because I realized that my intentions weren't relevant to the outcome. I could tell myself I hesitated to save the patrol. I could even believe it. The kid still limped. The kid still watched me like a man whose judgment had failed him. After that, I became more aggressive with decisions. Not braver, not smarter, just quicker. I stopped waiting for additional information. I started giving orders as soon as my brain formed a plan. People praised me for decisiveness. That praise felt like rot, because the truth was, I wasn't being decisive out of confidence. I was being decisive to avoid the feeling of hesitation ever again. I was trying to outrun the hand signal. The war ended the way things often end, unevenly, with rumor and paperwork and convoys going the other direction. There was no single moment of closure. There was a bus ride, there were demobilization forms, there was a final inspection where a board clerk checked my serial numbers and asked if I had any missing gear. I said no, because the missing thing wasn't on any list. I returned first to Veloya, my hometown, the crossing place with the river and the depot and my mother's kitchen. I expected relief. I felt absence. I expected recognition. I felt like a visitor with the right key. The silence of civilian life was different from the silence on watch. On watch, silence is tense, charged. In civilian life, silence is heavy because it doesn't have a purpose. No one needs you to interpret it. It just sits there. I got a job in the capital, Dranov, in logistics, because war had taught me that supplies matter more than speeches, and because I didn't know what else I was qualified for besides keeping systems running. I rented a small apartment with thin walls. I learned my neighbors' routines without wanting to. At night, when the building settled, I would sometimes hear small noises. A spoon in a sink, a door latch, a radiator click, and my body would jerk into readiness. Then my mind would slide into that orchard again, the White House, the wall, my palm going down. The memory followed me into ordinary places. A crowded tram where someone bumped me and my muscles tensed like I was about to command man. A supermarket line where impatience felt like threat. A blackout in the building where people laughed and lit candles, and I found myself scanning for exits. And the worst part wasn't the memories themselves. It was the way they shaped how I treated people. In the office, when someone asked for guidance, I gave it quickly, sometimes too quickly. I didn't like being asked because questions reminded me of Soren whispering, order, and the weight that came with answering. I started avoiding deeper relationships because intimacy invites trust, and trust invites the possibility of breaking it. I had friends who tried. A neighbor woman once asked if I could help her move a bookshelf. I did. She said I was reliable. The word reliable hit me like an insult disguised as praise. Reliable means predictable. It means people lean. I didn't want anyone leaning because I didn't trust the ground under my own decisions. I visited my mother less than I should have, not because I didn't love her, because every visit came with unspoken expectations that I would feel at home, that I would relax, that I would become the old version of myself around familiar furniture. I couldn't. I felt like a defective product returned to a store that didn't accept returns. Once in my mother's kitchen, she asked casually if I had any friends from the war I kept in touch with. I said a few. She asked about them like she was collecting proof that my experience had a social structure. I didn't mention Leshko. I didn't mention the night. I didn't mention that there was a man out there whose limp was tied to my hand. Years passed. Time in peace is strange. It doesn't sharpen memories the way war does. It blurs them at the edges, but certain moments stay crisp because you keep picking them up. The Vesna Hollow night stayed crisp for me. I carried it like a coin I couldn't spend. One year, on a random weekday, I received a message from an unknown number. It was short. It's L. Are you in Drenov? I stared at the screen longer than was normal. My thumb hovered over the keyboard like it was about to detonate something. Concrete action, I replied yes. Consequence, my hands started shaking, and I had to sit down at my desk while pretending to check a spreadsheet. He wrote that he was in the city for a medical evaluation. Leg still? He added, then deleted it and wrote, anyway, want coffee. Want coffee. Like we were old classmates, I almost said no, not out of anger, out of fear. The fear of seeing what my decision had become in his life. The fear of hearing a version of the story I couldn't control. The fear of apology, because apologies can be selfish. They can be a way to demand forgiveness. I didn't deserve forgiveness. I didn't even know if I deserved contact. I said yes anyway, because avoidance had owned too much of my life already. We met in a cafe near the river, a clean place with soft lights and people typing on laptops like they were building futures. Leshko arrived wearing a decent coat and carrying himself with the practiced posture of a man who has learned to hide pain in public. He looked older, not by years only, by expression. He sat across from me and ordered tea, not coffee. His hands were steady. The missing 2 fingers weren't missing. He had them, but the grip was different, the joint stiff. It was visible only if you looked. I looked. Specific event, we sat in silence for nearly a minute, 2 men in a cafe, failing at being normal. Concrete action. I said, I'm glad you're alive, because it was true and inadequate. Consequence, he gave a small, tired smile and said, yeah, same. He talked about his life in short, factual bursts. He had worked in a warehouse. He had tried studying. He had moved towns twice. He had a partner for a while. Then not. He mentioned his limp like it was weather. Bad days, he said. Cold makes it stupid. I waited for accusation. It didn't come. That made my stomach twist harder than anger would have. Finally, he said, I think about that night sometimes. My mouth went dry. My chest tightened. I could hear my own pulse. Concrete action, I nodded, because anything else felt like lying. Consequence, he continued, calmly. I used to think you screwed up, like personally, like you saw me and decided I was acceptable to lose. That sentence landed without drama. It was worse that way. No raised voice, no theatrical bitterness, just a plain statement. He took a sip of tea and said, then later I realized you didn't even see me. You saw the whole thing, the wall, the houses, the possibility of more trouble. I wanted to say something. An explanation. An apology. A justification. A confession. All of them felt like an attempt to reshape the outcome into a story where I was either villain or martyr. I was neither. I was a man making a choice with incomplete information and a tired brain. I said, I hesitated. He nodded. I know. Specific event, he looked out the cafe window at the river and said almost casually, the funny thing is that hesitation probably saved the rest of you. Concrete action, he shrugged like he was adjusting a jacket. Consequence, My throat tightened, because the sentence I had been using to justify myself for years came out of his mouth, and it didn't feel like absolution. It felt like confirmation that the math had been real, and that the math had still broken something human between us. He said, if you rushed, maybe you'd have caught the wire, maybe you'd have dragged us out faster, or maybe you'd have piled into that doorway, and we'd have lost 5 instead of 1 limping idiot. He smiled again, dark humor at his own expense, and I hated that I felt grateful for the joke because it made the conversation easier. I said quietly, I don't trust myself because of it. There. The real confession finally attached to a real moment, not floating around as philosophy. He stared at me for a long time. Then he said, that's the part I don't understand. Specific event. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. Concrete action. He tapped his cup once, a small sound. Consequence. I flinched, and he noticed it, and his eyes narrowed in recognition. He said, you made a call. It hurt me. It saved others. That's war. Why does it follow you like a debt you can't pay? I couldn't answer in a clean line, so I answered in pieces tied to events. I told him about the spoon in the sink, about how small noises pull me back, about how civilian silence feels heavier than gunfire because there's no mission attached to it, about how I avoid letting people trust me too much because I'm afraid of the moment when I'll have to decide again and my hand will choose wrong. He listened without interrupting. He didn't look offended. He looked tired in the same way I felt. When I finished, he said, you're still living like you're waiting for a report to come in? That sentence was accurate enough to sting. Concrete action, I laughed once, quietly, because it was either that or admit he was right in a way that would collapse me. Consequence, the tension in my chest loosened by a fraction, not because I was forgiven, but because someone had named the shape of my problem without turning it into drama. We talked another hour, not therapy. Just 2 men exchanging facts and small opinions. He told me he still hated doorways in the dark. I told him I still hate making decisions when people are watching. He said, then stop letting them watch. And I almost smiled because it sounded like advice from a boy who used to offer spare batteries to feel useful. When we stood to leave, there was an awkward moment where people would normally hug or shake hands or pat shoulders. We did none of those. We nodded. We walked out separately. Specific event outside the cafe. The air was cold, and the river smelled like wet stone. Concrete action. I watched him walk away, his limp barely visible, until he stepped off the curb. Consequence, I realized the trust I had broken wasn't his trust in me anymore. He had rebuilt his life around the reality of that night. The trust that was broken was mine, in my own judgment, and I had been using his imagined accusation as a way to keep punishing myself without changing. That night, back in my apartment, I made tea and sat by the window. The spoon in the sink still existed. The pipe still clicked. The city still hummed. The memory didn't vanish. It never will. But something shifted. I stopped asking whether I made the right choice. As if there were a right choice in that orchard. The question had been eating years because it suggested there was a clean answer I could discover if I replayed it enough times. There isn't. What there is a decision that saved others and broke my confidence. A hesitation that protected a group and marked one man's body. A consequence I can't undo. In the war, responsibility came early and arrived loud. In peace, responsibility is quieter, but it's still there, and it's still mine. I can either keep living as if I'm on watch, waiting for a mission that will justify my tension. Or I can accept that the tension is just a scar pattern, not a duty. I'm not saying I've healed. That word is too clean. But after meeting Leshko, I started doing one concrete thing differently. When someone at work asks for guidance, I take a breath before answering, not to hesitate out of fear, but to remember that civilian decisions rarely have the same stakes and that I'm allowed to be human about them. I let myself ask questions. I let myself say, I don't know yet. I let other people carry their own weight sometimes. A week after the cafe, I washed dishes and a spoon clinked against the sink again. I felt the jolt. I stood still. I let the jolt pass through me without chasing it into the orchard. My hands shook slightly. Then they stopped. That's not bravery. It's not redemption. It's just the smallest possible form of control, staying in the present when the past offers itself like a familiar room. Late at night alone, the story still comes back. I still see my palm going down. I still hear the muffled crack inside the house. I still see Leshko being dragged out, eyes wide, trying to speak. That will always be part of my internal geography. But now, when I reach that moment, I also remember the cafe, the river outside, the way he said, "You're still living like you're waiting for a report," and I remember that the war ended. Even if my habits didn't get the memo right away, I have to live with the choice. That hasn't changed. What has changed is this: I no longer pretend that replaying it will produce a different outcome. I don't get to rewrite it. I only get to decide what kind of man I am in the quiet that follows. Tonight, the city is quiet enough that I can hear the transformer hum behind the building. My tea is cooling. The spoon is back in the drawer. I'm still here. That's the only clean fact I trust. And it has to be enough. After the cafe, I didn't feel lighter. That surprised me. I had expected something to release: guilt, tension, maybe that constant pressure behind the eyes that comes from replaying the same 10 seconds for years. Instead, what I felt was a kind of administrative clarity, like closing a file, not because it was resolved, but because everything that could be added had already been added. I walked home along the river, hands in my pockets, shoulders up against the cold. The city lights reflected on the water in broken lines, shaking every time the current caught debris. I watched them without trying to read anything into it. I was tired of metaphors. What stayed with me from the conversation wasn't forgiveness. He hadn't offered it, and I hadn't asked. What stayed was the way he spoke about the night as something finished, not something alive. For years, that moment had been active inside me, like a device left armed. For him, it had become part of the background, damaging, permanent, but no longer demanding daily attention. That difference bothered me more than blame ever had. At home, I sat at the table and opened my laptop without knowing why. I stared at an empty document for a while, then closed it. I wasn't going to write it down. Writing would turn it into a performance, and I was done performing the same confession to myself. That night I slept badly anyway. Not because of dreams, because my body still hadn't learned that some tensions don't need guarding. 2 weeks later, I took time off work and went back to Velia. I didn't tell anyone at the office why. I didn't frame it as something important. I just said I needed a few days. The train ride was short and uneventful. Fields, gray sky, the same stations with different names painted on the same concrete shapes. When we crossed the Sarnava River, I watched the water out of habit, counting nothing. The station clock was still perfectly accurate. I noticed that noticing it didn't hurt anymore. My mother opened the door with the same quick hug, the same apology for squeezing too hard. She asked if I was hungry. I said yes. Some routines don't need justification. We ate in the kitchen, steam fogging the window. She talked about a leak in the stairwell, about a neighbor's grandson who broke his arm falling from the blue exercise frame in the courtyard. She laughed when she told it, then stopped herself, then laughed again because the boy was fine and laughter doesn't need permission. I listened, really listened, not scanning for subtext, not preparing answers, just listening. After dinner, she asked if I could help her with the balcony door again. It had started sticking worse in the cold. I took my tools and worked on it while she stood nearby, handing me screws I hadn't asked for. The hinge was warped this time. I adjusted it as best I could, knowing it would never be perfect. Concrete event a door that wouldn't close properly. Concrete action, I fixed it enough. Consequence, the door still made a small noise when closing, but it closed. My mother said, "That'll do," and didn't ask for more. Later that evening, I went down to the courtyard alone. The blue metal frame was wet with frost. No children. No voices, just the hum of nearby traffic and the sound of someone's television bleeding through a window. I stood where the old swing used to be. I didn't imagine it back into place. I didn't try to feel like a child again. I just stood and let the cold bite my fingers until it was time to go back inside. The next morning, something happened that I hadn't planned on. I was walking back from the market with groceries when I heard shouting near the crossing by the old depot. Two men were arguing. Loud, sharp voices, the kind that draw attention without actually resolving anything. One of them had a car half blocking the street, hazard lights blinking uselessly. The other was gesturing wildly, pointing at the road, at the car, at the sky. People stopped to watch. No one stepped in. The old alignment stirred. Distance. Volume. Escalation potential. I felt my body preparing to move before I told it to do anything. For years, this was where I would step forward, take control, issue instructions, end the noise. Instead, I paused. Concrete event, a public argument, blocking traffic. Concrete action, I didn't intervene immediately. I watched for 10 seconds. What I saw in those 10 seconds mattered. One man wasn't aggressive. He was panicked. The other wasn't angry. He was late. They weren't about to fight. They were stuck in a feedback loop of raised voices and no solutions. I stepped forward then, not as a commander, not as a fixer, but as a third body. I didn't shout. I didn't assert authority. I pointed at the curb and said, calmly, "Push it there. Together." They looked at me like they didn't recognize the language at first. Then they did. They pushed the car. It rolled. Traffic resumed. The argument collapsed under the weight of physical effort. External consequence, the street cleared. Internal consequence, no surge. No aftermath. No echo. One of the men thanked me awkwardly. The other just nodded and drove off. No one called me brave. No one needed a story. I went home with my groceries and realized something simple and uncomfortable. That wasn't a correction of the past. That wasn't redemption. That was competence without urgency. Back in Drenov a few days later, I returned to work. Same desk, same screens. Same low-level chaos of civilian systems that never quite work but never fully fail either. A junior colleague asked me for advice on a delayed shipment. I asked questions instead of answering immediately. We figured it out together. It took longer. It felt better. That evening, alone again, I washed dishes. A spoon slipped. It hit the sink. I flinched. I didn't spiral. The sound passed. I thought about Vesna Hollow one last time that night, not as a frozen scene, but as a sequence of actions and consequences, none of which could be undone and none of which required further punishment. I hesitated. Others were saved. One man paid a price. I carried the weight longer than he did. That doesn't make me noble. It doesn't make me broken. It makes me responsible for how I live after. The war taught me that decisions matter, even when you don't have enough information. Peace is teaching me something harder, that not every situation requires a decision from me, and not every silence is a threat. Tonight the city is quiet again, not the charged quiet of watch duty, just night doing what night does. I don't wait for orders. I don't rehearse explanations. I let the day end. That's the end of the story. Not because everything is resolved, but because nothing else needs to be proved.